Tonight we're talking about pillow talk, and next week the invasion of the superbugs due to some infectious disease. So our first speaker is Dr. Michael J. Satay, physician, who earned his MD degree from Duke University School of Medicine in Durham, North Carolina, completed a residency and a fellowship in psychiatry at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, and joined the DHMC staff in '79. Currently serves as professor of psychiatry at Dartmouth Medical School and chief of the section of sleep medicine at DHMC. Dr. Satay is past president of the American Academy of Sleep and the American Insomnia Association. He currently sits on the Accreditation Council of Graduate Medical Education Advisory Committee for Sleep Medicine and the American Board of Internal Medicine Policy and Test Committee for Sleep Medicine. Among his many honors, in 2009, Dr. Satay received the Nathaniel Kleitman Award from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, which honors individuals dedicated to the sleep field who have made significant contributions in the areas of administration, public relations, and government affairs. He's authored numerous scientific articles in sleep medicine, focusing primarily on insomnia and professional education in sleep, and is the editor of the book, Insomnia, Diagnosis and Treatment, which was released in 2010. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Satay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My thanks to Dr. Green for the kind invitation. Tonight, Dr. Judd and I are going to be giving you a sort of galloping view of modern sleep research and sleep medicine. And of course, like all of the other subjects you've heard about, this is a subject that is vast, and so we're only skimming the surface of it. In order to set the stage for tonight, what I'd like to do is show you a very brief video clip for starters. The clip is an interview with Dr. Derek Bach, who's the eminent former president of Harvard University, a very well-respected scholar. And Derek Bach was being interviewed about his new book called The Politics of Happiness, and discussing public policy and its impact on happiness. And this was about a year ago or so. Much to my amazement, he had this to say.
Let me give you an example from healthcare, for example. If you look at the research, you find that remarkably a number of the unhappy things that can happen to you from a health standpoint really don't have very long-lasting effects on your unhappiness at all. You get over the loss of an arm quite quickly. But there are three health conditions that produce lasting unhappiness of a very acute kind. One is clinical depression. Millions of people suffer from that. Another one is chronic pain, more millions of people. And the third one is rather unexpected, is sleep disorders. And there are, again, millions of people who suffer from insomnia and related disorders. Now, the interesting thing from a policy point of view is that all of those three illnesses are comparatively under-resourced and underemphasized.
Well, there you go. So Dr. Bach has drunk the Kool-Aid, and he understands the importance of healthy sleep to our happiness and to our physical and mental health. And so if there's any message that you take away tonight, we would like for you to understand that. Now, as Dr. Green alluded to, you know, we spend a third of our lives in this state of consciousness, and yet it's quite remarkable that for most of biological and medical science through the centuries, sleep has been a subject of tremendous disinterest. Nobody's had very much to say. Ian Forster, the author of Passage to India and many other novels, did make a note in the 40s about basic facts of human life: birth, food, love, sleep, and death. This may be a tad reductionistic, but I think he got it more or less right. And he didn't have a lot to say about sleep. But what he did say was to note that sleep, in fact, does occupy a third of our lives, and that what is called history has only busied itself with the 2/3 of the human cycle that is related to wakefulness. It's really only in the last few decades that we've begun to turn our attention to this. And the more we have turned our attention to sleep and sleep health and its impact on function, quality of life, and physical health, the more important we understand this to be. So tonight, my goals are 3 simple goals. Number 1, I want to give you a basic primer on what sleep is and some of the basic science of sleep. And I've tried to boil this down as best I can. We'll see how well I do. I want to talk about sleep deprivation, which is an enormous public health problem, and we'll discuss that from several dimensions. And then finally, I want to talk about insomnia, especially chronic insomnia, the impact that has, and some of the things that one can do about this. Well, when people did think about sleep, they typically viewed sleep as a passive phenomenon. Why should medical science be interested in this? Because all that happens is that the normal metabolic and brain functions kind of turn off, end of story, ho-hum. And in fact, the person who was credited with being the father of modern sleep medicine and research, and that's Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago, had this to say, that in spite of sleep being frequently designated as an actively initiated process, there's not a single fact about sleep that cannot be equally well interpreted as a letdown of waking activity. So Kleitman himself is suggesting it's just turning off wakefulness. Who really cares? This is 39. But Kleitman persevered, and it turns out in 1953, 14 years later, in his very own lab with a graduate student by the name of Eugene Azarinsky, they were monitoring the sleep and eye activity of infants. And what they noticed was that every so often, in the case of infants, quite often, they would see these bursts of very rapid eye activity during sleep. They went on to further assess this, and this was the discovery of rapid eye movement sleep. And all of you recognize the term REM sleep now as a distinct state of consciousness characterized by an active brain, and it is active, we know, in the form of dream activity, along with rapid eye movement and muscle paralysis that occurs during REM sleep. So this really gave lie to the notion that sleep was simply a passive process. Obviously, there are some very active, highly controlled things that are going on here that are far from passive. Now, the work went on, and the basic structure of sleep over the next several years was identified, and we now know that there are, in fact, 3 distinct states of consciousness. Our waking lives, and in wake, of course, we have an active brain, hopefully, hoping that all of yours remain active for a while at least. And we're responsive to external stimuli. So we're seeing, we're hearing, we're touching, and our brain is in part being activated by those stimuli. Non-REM sleep represents a relatively inactive brain. Now, relatively, because if you wake people up in non-REM, they may give you some cognitive reports of activity, but less so, certainly, than in waking or in REM sleep. A lot of muscle relaxation here. Physiology is at a low point. And our brain is actively cut off from sensory input. So there's a gate there that is restricting the flow of sensory information to the cortex. During rapid eye movement sleep, however, our cortex reactivates. And instead of responding to external stimuli, the cortex is now being bombarded by electrical activity that is flowing from the lower portion of the brain to the cortex and activating the cortex. And it is that bombardment of the upper brain with this electrical activity that we experience as our dream life. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about why some of this may occur. The honest answer is we're still not sure. When we put all of this together, we get these various sleep stages. And as many of you know, we have non-REM sleeps, 1, 2, and 3, and then REM. And I know you can't see these very well, but essentially, these are brainwave recordings. And if we count numbers of brain waves per second, we would find that there are many, many brain waves, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 waves per second during waking. We close our eyes and relax, still awake. This slows down a bit, and we generate what's called an alpha rhythm. And that's about 8 to 12 waves per second. As we drift off to sleep, the frequency of waves slows down, stage 1, stage 2, and now in the deepest non-REM sleep, we see that there's only about 1 wave per second. So all of the brain cells in the cortex are sort of firing together in synchrony, very much unlike the waking brain. However, in REM sleep, you'll notice that the frequency of these waves picks up again tremendously, representing activation of the cortex once again. When we put all of that together, what we find is that there is a regular cycle of non-REM and REM sleep throughout the night. And typically, there'll be 3 to 5 non-REM REM cycles. You'll also notice that the deepest stages of non-REM sleep occur early in the night. So for example, in young kids who are sleepwalkers, sleepwalking comes out of this deep non-REM sleep. They're very likely to have these episodes during the first couple of hours of the night, whereas nightmare activity that is linked to REM sleep is more likely to dominate in the latter portion of the night. Stage 2 kind of holds all of this together. Now, I'm pushing the envelope with these next 2 slides. The point that I want to make is relatively simple, however. Sleep is an actively controlled process. There are groups of cells in the hypothalamus, which sits at the base of the brain, that have only been discovered in the last decade or so. And these are wake-on cells. And when these are activated, they activate other wake-active regions in the lower portion of the brain stem. Now, what's important here is that not only do these things turn on during wake, but they also actively inhibit sleep-active cells. If we go then to sleep, we find that not only are the sleep-on cells active, but they actively inhibit the wake cells, both the controller cells and the brainstem cells. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, this is a process of mutual reciprocal inhibition, and engineers have a term for this, and they call it a flip-flop switch, all right? What this reciprocal inhibition does is it produces a very rapid state transition. So you see the fulcrum point here, and this moves rapidly between sleep and wake. Imagine if instead we had a process in which, well, you know, we kind of gradually wake up, we get out of bed, and then we spend 4 or 5 hours sort of getting to alertness, and then we got 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon when we're really alert, and then we kind of start gradually slipping back into sleep in the latter portion of the day, we wouldn't be very functional. We would spend a large portion of our lives sort of half in the bag, so to speak. The way in which this is controlled is very important and represents a kind of on-off switch. Another slightly complicated slide, but I promise this is about it. How is all of this controlled? Well, we refer to what is called the two-process model of sleep, right? And the two processes are the homeostatic process and the clock, or the circadian process. The homeostat is very simple. The longer we are awake, the greater the drive to sleep. Duh, right? I mean, we all experience that quite regularly. The wake drive coming from the clock, and now we're referring to the biological clock that sits at the base of the brain, and Dr. Judd is going to talk more about circadian rhythms and chronobiology. But this is a wake drive, and it actually opposes the increasing sleepiness of the homeostatic drive. So as we become progressively more sleepy through the day, our circadian wake drive is progressively increasing and counteracting that so we can maintain adequate alertness through the day. It reaches its peak, the clock drive, late in the day and then begins to dissipate. You'll notice that wake drive is at its lowest point in the very early 4 or 5 a.m. time. This, by the way, not by no coincidence, is the time when, for shift workers, maximal errors, accidents, motor vehicle accidents in truck drivers occur because their circadian sleep drive is exceptionally low at this point. Residents who have been up all night have a very high homeostatic drive. They feel like death warmed over here, but by the time they get onto rounds at 10 or 11 in the morning, they actually feel better because this has started to pick up some. Now, here's the summation then. We become alert. Now, many of you will recognize this normal physiologic afternoon crash, and that is a clock circadian phenomenon. Reach high alertness in the evening and then drop off to sleep. This all begs the question, why do we sleep in the first place? And the answer is, we're really not sure. What I'm going to give you are just a few samplings of current theory about the function of sleep. But you know, Mother Nature is no fool, and it certainly would not have designed us to spend 8 hours of our 24-hour day in this function unless there was some darn good reason. Is sleep for the body? Are we trying to restore our bodies somehow when we sleep, conserve energy? Is sleep mostly for the brain, development, memory consolidation? Maybe all of these. Non-REM sleep has been associated with energy conservation. And what you see here on the vertical axis is metabolic rate, essentially. So the higher we go here, the higher the metabolic rate of the animal. On the horizontal axis is the amount of non-REM sleep in hours. And here you cannot read it very well, I know, but this is a vast array of different mammals. And what we see is that small mammals, like bats and shrews and moles and mice, very high metabolic rates, and they spend huge amounts of their lives sleeping, 20 hours in many cases. Because sleep is a metabolic bargain for these animals. They sleep to save energy and to survive. On the other hand, animals with relatively lower metabolic rate, large animals like elephants and cows and horses, spend only 2 to 4 hours a day sleeping. Their energy requirements are less demanding because of their lower metabolic rate. So energy conservation is a theory of non-REM sleep, still not fully accepted. What about sleep for the brain? Well, some of you may have seen a lot of the information that has emerged about the role of sleep, both non-REM and REM sleep, in memory consolidation. And there's a huge amount of research in this area. I'm just going to tell you one little vignette from this. So if we take a tiny little electrode and implant it in a brain cell or several brain cells, several electrodes and several brain cells of a laboratory rat, and we put that rat in a novel environment, the first thing that the animal does is to try to figure out where it is and how to orient within that environment, okay? And that's a learning task. We can record what's happening in the nerve cells, both in the cortex and in the hippocampus, which is thought to be important in memory consolidation, during the active exposure to this environment. What's curious, though, is that if you then record those same nerve cells during sleep, they play back in almost the identical fashion in which they fired during the active exposure. So the brain is playing back what it has seen for the purpose of consolidating memories and strengthening these associations of nerve cells. So the theory that sleep, both non-REM and REM, is for memory is a strong theory, although again, still contested. So, in summary then, sleep fulfills multiple needs, probably not just for the body or the brain, but both. There's a great deal of research that still needs to be done on this, in this area. Well, with that physiology background, let me then switch gears and talk to you a little bit about sleep deprivation, something that I suspect many of you are not entirely unfamiliar with. Now, if we take healthy middle-aged adult sleepers and we put them in an environment and say, we want you to just sleep at liberty, okay? No work schedules, no nothing, no alarm clocks. What we find is that people average out about 8.1, 8.2 hours per night. There is, of course, a normal distribution of that, but the mean is just a little over 8 hours. This demonstrates the actual sleep length of people in the real world. And what you see in particular here is the very large number of people who are sleeping 7 hours or less. Dr. Green was talking about his kids and you know, how busy they are. You know, they can't sleep in on the weekends even because they've got to go to soccer practice or what have you. About 25 to 30% of males are sleeping 6 hours or less, somewhat smaller numbers for women. So, construct one, sleep deprivation is rampant in our society. When people are sleep deprived, they get more sleepy. What we're looking at here is how long it takes people to fall asleep in the sleep laboratory. This is a standard measure of sleepiness that we use. So the lower the number here, the sleepier people are. And after a single night, we can see at 9 hours, people are quite alert. Takes them 15, 16, 17 minutes to fall asleep. 7 hours a night, we see somewhat increase in sleepiness. Not a huge change at 5 hours. When we get down to 4 hours, people are extremely sleepy, and with total sleep deprivation, of course, they can hardly hold their heads up. Now, this is acute sleep deprivation, and many of us face that on occasion, but for most of us, the bigger problem is chronic low-grade sleep deprivation. And you think, well, you know, I slept an hour less a night or a couple hours less than I should have, but big deal. What we need to keep in mind is that this is a cumulative phenomenon. So this is sleeping 5 to 6 hours per night over the course of a week. And you can see that on day one, the individual is really quite awake and alert. It takes him 15 minutes on average to fall asleep on these daytime nap studies. One day, sleepier, day 3, 4, out to a week, and at this point, falling asleep on average in 5 minutes on these daytime naps, profoundly sleepy. These are very impaired individuals. So with modest sleep deprivation accumulated over the course of just 1 week, we see huge impairment develop. So why should we be concerned? Well, let me give you some examples of why this is both a health and public policy problem. Some of you may have young students. We see grade point average by sleep, and you'll notice that the longer sleepers, much higher grade point average than those sleeping less. Now, I'll be the first to say this is a complicated issue. There are other variables here, but nevertheless, we see this sort of thing reproduced quite often. In medicine, we have trainees, residents, who are often quite sleep deprived, and they're also shift workers. Now, what you're looking at here is a subjective measure of sleepiness. And we simply ask people, how likely are you to doze off in a variety of settings, like reading, watching TV, riding in a car? And we add up those scores. The maximum score is 24. If we ask normal sleepers, they roll in with a score of about 6. People with insomnia, in fact, quite alert, have trouble napping. People with sleep apnea, Dr. Judd will discuss this, but a notoriously sleepy group, have an average score of 12. People with narcolepsy, profound disease of sleepiness, scores of 18. And Houston, we have a problem because the residents are here with a score of 15, which is really quite sleepy and in anyone's book significantly impaired. This shows a reasoning task and compares sleep deprivation in residents to alcohol intoxication. They administered alcohol up to a blood alcohol level of 0.1 or legal intoxication. They compared this to the impairment in reasoning associated with hours of sleep deprivation. And you can see that by about 18 hours of sleep deprivation, the reasoning is impaired equivalent to legal intoxication. You might also notice that out at 24 hours, they've almost dropped off the chart and are severely impaired. Well, if I haven't made you afraid to go to the doctor or the hospital, then let's see what else we can do. When we're sleepy, we lose our ability to maintain vigilance and attention. Here's again cumulative sleep debt. Those sleeping 8 hours a night show very low error rates, which is on the vertical axis. This is number of errors. And these are basically attentional lapses, where they miss the cue. This, for example, would be what air traffic controllers, just happened to pull that one out of the blue, need to do, right? They're sitting at screens. They have to pay attention. If they have attentional lapses, people die. 6 hours a night, a lot of people sleeping that. Steady impairment over 2 weeks. 4 hours, even more impairment, total sleep deprivation off the charts, right? So again, cumulative sleep deprivation produces attentional lapses. So speaking of air traffic, study was done with pilots, all right? And the pilots were asked, have you ever nodded off in the cockpit? 70%. Yes. What's worse? They recorded the last hour and a half of this 9-hour transatlantic flight and found 120 microsleeps, that is 5 seconds or longer, when there was nobody home, brain-wise. And 20% of those happened when the wheels were literally hitting the tarmac. We had an airline pilot said, no, the airline's no longer in business, who was taking off from a major hub and said that he was so sleepy. He was flying a 747. He was so sleepy trying to pull this thing off the runway that he could hardly keep his head up. Okay, so no hospitals, no flying. Still no flying. Of course, the air traffic controllers, of course, we've seen just this huge plethora of problems with air traffic controllers. They're sleep deprived. They're shift workers. They have to sit there and stare at those screens. It's a horrible attentional task, very difficult. And also, they're sedentary, so as Dr. Judd will probably tell you, a lot of them gain weight and they're obese and they develop sleep apnea as well. So we have a problem there. Well, if you can't fly, then maybe you drive instead, okay? Oh, more trouble. National Sleep Foundation survey, 13% of people report that they doze off at the wheel anywhere from a couple days a month to 3 or more days a week. This has just, in the last decade, gotten on the radar screen, so to speak, of the National Transportation Board, and there are a lot of initiatives, both with respect to the airline industry, the trucking industry is all over this, and general driving safety issues. Here, let me talk a little bit about some of the physiologic health impacts of sleep deprivation. I mean, we've seen how this can affect alertness, vigilance, performance in some of these very important occupational settings, as well as academically. But let's talk about metabolic effects. Now, you'll notice here, these are sleep needs for various age groups. I don't know how many of you know teenagers that are consistently getting 9 or 10 hours of sleep a night, but I don't think there are very many. I mean, yeah, they get 12 or 18 on the weekend maybe, but not so much during the week. So we have a very sleep deprived, and this is, you know, affecting younger and younger kids. You know, they're so busy, homework and sports and so forth and so on. Well, you know, there's been a lot of concern about the obesity epidemic in children. I mean, in adults as well. And what I'm going to say applies to adults, but the case can be made particularly for children. When we look at the correlation between not sleeping enough and obesity, what we find is that the odds of being obese are about twice as high if you are a short sleeping youngster. And these are pooled studies from ages 2 to 20 years, defining short sleep as less than 10 hours per night. So twice the risk of obesity in short sleeping children. That number is a little less in adults. And again, it's a complex relationship. Nevertheless, we believe that sleep deprivation plays an important role in contributing to obesity. Why would this be? Well, for several reasons. Number one, there are some hormones that are important in the control of appetite. Leptin is a satiety hormone. When we are sleep deprived, leptin levels drop, appetite increases, we take in more calories. In addition, if we're awake longer, more opportunity to eat, right? Stay up on the internet, watching the late news, grab a snack. Also, for sleep deprived, we're tired. We exercise less, we expend less energy, all contributing to obesity. It doesn't stop here. There now is evidence emerging that sleep deprivation is associated with greater proclivity to the development of diabetes. We also know that immune function is compromised, and we're beginning to see work emerge on impairment in cardiovascular function with sleep deprivation. To return to Dr. Bach very briefly, the issue of sleep health and happiness. And what we see is that in terms of life satisfaction, being divorced, as you might imagine, negatively correlates. Having more money, higher education, shows some degree of correlation with satisfaction. But what showed the highest correlation by far with life satisfaction was good sleep quality. We live in a culture that historically has not considered sleep to be very important. We have songs like "I'll Sleep When I'm Dead," beer commercials, "Who Needs Sleep?" We have constant distractions from the internet, other media, and our busy lives that cut into our sleep time. Sleep is the first to go. If you haven't gotten the point yet, here we are, the summary, all of these things that I've talked about: reduced attention, cognitive function. And in case you missed it, I've translated this over here, that in effect, sleep deprivation is associated with being distracted, slow-witted, grouchy, sad, clumsy, fat, sick, and eventually dead. All right, in the last few minutes, I want to talk about insomnia. Insomnia is a subjective phenomenon. You know, when we see someone, essentially, if they complain of trouble getting to sleep, staying asleep, early awakening, and whatnot, and that complaint is associated with daytime consequences, then we consider that they have insomnia. The one caveat here is that this must occur despite adequate opportunity and circumstance for sleep. So, in other words, if you're just not going to bed, you're sleep deprived. You don't have insomnia, and they are two different things, and they have different consequences. Both negative consequences, but somewhat different. Now, again, why do we fret about this? I mean, you know, insomnia, what's the big deal? Well, this is quality of life ratings, and we're looking at insomnia, congestive heart failure, major depression. These two, of course, considered very serious, debilitating issues associated with a lot of impairment in quality of life. And here, if you look at the gold bars for insomnia, you see that almost across the board, the people with insomnia had quality of life as poor or poorer than people with these other major illnesses, medical and psychiatric. Chronic insomnia, we now believe, on the basis of many studies, is a risk factor for the development of psychiatric illness as well. They looked at people in this particular study who had no insomnia at baseline, and people who had insomnia at baseline and 3.5 years later. And the people with persistent insomnia, that is, at the beginning and at the 3.5-year follow-up, had a 4 times higher rate of onset of major depression, twice the rate of onset of anxiety disorders, okay? So, again, not absolutely established, but strong evidence suggesting that this is a risk factor for very serious psychiatric disease. The model for insomnia that we currently utilize is called the so-called 3P model, predisposing factors. All of us are born as probably better sleepers or not such good sleepers. Some of us, you know, are told by our parents that even in the crib we never slept. and have been lifelong poor sleepers. We don't understand a lot about this. The second P are precipitating factors. And these are things like stresses or illnesses, depression, or other sleep disorders that sort of get the insomnia problem rolling to begin with. What's very important here, though, are the so-called perpetuating factors. And these are behavioral, learned factors that cement this process in place and that fuel it and keep it going. And I will speak to that a little bit more momentarily. So from a practical standpoint, what do we want to do for insomnia? Well, if there's depression, if there's a medical problem, obviously we want to address that. Substances can be problematic. Caffeine has a very long half-life. I had a Vermont farmer once told me he drank a pot of coffee. I said, wow, you're drinking 8 cups a day. He said, oh no, 40-cup percolator. Some people don't get it. Alcohol is the most widely used sleep aid in the world. It'll put you to sleep if you drink enough of it, but it'll wake you up after a short period of time. And of course, if you make that a habit, it'll create all kinds of problems for you. Schedule issues, shift work, Dr. Judd's going to talk about. Chronic pain and other medical issues are huge problems as well. Dr. Judd will get into these other sleep disorders. Good sleep hygiene. You all have heard this term. Keeping a regular schedule. Not watching the clock. Having a nice wind down time before we go to sleep. Using the bed only for sleep, and getting out of bed if you can't sleep. And this is probably the single most important behavioral issue. People with chronic insomnia cling to the bed desperately, hoping for that sleep that never comes. And this is, of course, the worst thing that they can do, because what is happening is that they are associating the bed with sleeplessness, with anxiety, with frustration, with desperation. The more they do that, the more they lie there, the more that association becomes established. Put the clock away. The bane of our existence is the digital clock, especially the one that shines the time on the ceiling. So it's like a torture chamber in there. All right. What about medicine? There are good sleep medicines that work. They can help people with sleep problems. What they don't do, though, is resolve the underlying behavioral and learned factors that I've been talking about, all right? So while you take them, you may take them, they may help. If you've got a short-term insomnia problem, it goes away, great. But if you've got chronic insomnia, you take the medicine, maybe it helps, you stop taking it, guess what? Within a short period of time, typically you're back to where you were to begin with. So medicines provide relief while they're being taken, but their long-term effectiveness after discontinuation is suspect. Here, the most important aspect of treatment in chronic insomnia today is cognitive behavioral treatment. And this is unlearning all of these negative factors that I described, the worry over sleep loss, ruminating, how am I going to feel the next day? Well, I better spend 20 hours a day in bed if I can't get enough sleep. If I didn't fall asleep quickly enough, then I'll sleep in until 10 or 11 in the morning, or maybe I'll nap. The consequences, depression, fatigue, and increasing arousal. And we now think of chronic insomnia as a disorder of hyperarousal. The brain doesn't stop even during sleep. The cardiovascular system is hyperaroused. Other aspects of the physiology are constantly, our whole metabolism is sped up 24 hours a day in chronic insomnia. So with that, I'm going to stop. This sets the stage for Dr. Judd's discussion of obstructive sleep apnea. Thank you very much for your attention.